Hi guys, thank you for tuning in. This is your Brain on Comics, and I'm Heather Ness. I attend Comic Cons and talk about the psychology of really like different stories and different characters. And I've been coming to MomoCon for the past few years. I'm really excited to be able to still bring you some of the content that I was planning on before all of this stuff went on, but now the organizers at MomoCon have been awesome enough to put together streaming these panels for you guys on Twitch. So my background, just so you guys get a sense of who's talking at you right now, I guess, is my background is in clinical psychology. So that's like mental health, diagnosis, treatment of that. I was an instructor at a university for a few years, and now I'm actually back in school and studying at Georgia State University in educational psychology. So my research interest really is in stories and why they're important to us, how they affect us, how we understand them, how we create them in all their different forms. And one of my favorite forms of storytelling is comics. Comics are really meaningful to me, and I think they kind of get a bad rap. People talk about comics kind of like they're somehow inferior to other types of storytelling, that they're somehow, I guess, less intellectual. But what I'm going to do here is talk to you about what all your brain has to do in order to even understand a comic, what all you're doing as you're going through these pages and reading them and enjoying these stories that maybe you're not even aware of, because your brain is doing it so fast. It's actually pretty amazing. So I'm going to talk to you guys about a couple of different things. So first I'm going to start off with like the science of reading comics, your brain on comics, and then later on we're going to talk a little bit more about like what's going on with the art of comics, which I think is really cool. But we'll start off with the science, and the first part to kind of talk about is just straight up biology. And so like, I know that maybe this is kind of breaking it down in like really basic ideas, but you know, you open up a comic book, or you're holding a comic book and you're looking at that cover page, and right then your brain is already working. You have this visual stimulation, you know, and from the comic book page, and it comes in through your eye. And I'm not going to go all into the biology of your eye, but your eye takes that visual information and it gets turned into a neural impulse that travels down your optic nerve. It goes kind of to what's called the relay center of your brain, the thalamus. It's right there in the center of your brain, and your thalamus is like, okay, cool, visual information, I know exactly where to send that to get processed, and that's going to go all the way back to the back of your brain called the occipital lobe, and that's the part of your brain that really processes visual information. And that's just kind of the beginning of it. But like the very beginning, you know, your brain is already engaged in doing something with before you're even reading, just looking at things. So this info is coming into your mind, and your brain turns that into something, and turns it into a piece of information that it can now deal with. And so if you're looking at something, your eyes are focused on it, you're paying attention. Okay, so that's kind of the next step. And again, I'm breaking this into kind of basic terms, but you're paying attention. You're looking at the page. So what are you looking at? So your eyes, you might not even notice this as well, but they're looking all over the page. They're looking like, what is the most pertinent information that I need to look at so that I can read this story? And the thing is so we kind of look at attention and how long do our eyes focus on a piece of information. And we have these cool eye movement studies where these researchers actually study like where does your eye focus and for how long and what do they move to and in like what order. It's pretty cool. But we're seeing things where it's like, okay, if something has like a lot of detail or it's hard for us to process and to understand what's really going on, we have to look at it longer, you know? So if you want your reader to focus on a page for a longer amount of time, you want to add details. But if you want the reader to be able to just like go through pretty quickly, not a whole lot of details. Like if you look at this this image I have up here from Hellboy, look at that. There's not really a whole lot of details, but still your brain is able to understand like what's going on there. So like just like these very stripped down minimal lines, you make out it's a rock, or just very stripped down lines into these shapes. Now you have like you interpret that as a hand, and your brain is able to do it like super fast. So what we do is when we're looking at comic books, there is so much visual information. I mean, you have an entire page that constant pictures, constant details, and especially depending on like the artist's style, how much detail is put into those images. And then you also have text and reading that. So you have all of this, and then you can only pay attention to so much information at a time. So you're also kind of picking out, okay, what is the most important thing for me to be able to pay attention to? And in addition to all of that, you have to navigate a comic book page. Like, where is the next step that I'm going to go to? So not only am I paying attention to certain information, but I'm paying attention to that information in a very particular order. And if you were like maybe like new to comics, if you didn't pick it up like as a kid, I remember like reading comics, but like really early on. I might have been like 9 or so, and picking up a comic book, but trying to figure out the navigation of a comic book page took me a little bit. Or like, for example, I think I really started reading manga about a few years ago, and that is different than my typical reading, because I'm not reading left to right and starting with, I don't want to say starting with the first page, because it is starting with the first page in manga, but like on one side of the book as opposed to the other side of the book. And now I'm reading right to left instead, and it was just different. So I had to slow down a little bit until I got used to it, and then my reading got faster as I got used to it, is basically what I'm saying. So if you're not used to navigation or figuring out, okay, what's the information that I'm going to look at first, you might have to, maybe you go somewhere in a page and you're like, okay, let me try, okay, that's the information I'm supposed to get first. Now I'm going back down to here. So where do we focus when we're looking at this? So we're navigating like a comic book page. We start with the top panel, or at the top of the page, and reading left to right, kind of like how we read text in American comics anyways. So again, I was talking about like those different eye movement studies that people are able to do, where they watch, okay, here's where people's eyes land, here's where they focus, and here's for how long. So how do people read comics? And some of the findings that people have found is like, yeah, they start off looking at the text, they start off looking at the image, but then they go back to the text. They look at the image first very quickly, but then they find the text. Text takes longer for us to understand and for us to process than it does for looking at an image. So like, for example, say a dog is you're standing out in your yard and a dog is running at you. You can see a dog running at you and understand what's happening faster probably than if you had read the sentence, a dog is running at me, very quickly as I am standing in the yard. It takes you more time, even though people are fast readers, can be fast readers. It takes you longer to read that and to process it relatively than it does for you to just look at an image and understand what's going on. Even though both are pretty fast, but one is still longer than the other. So sometimes we try to like pull out the text first in order to try and understand what's going on. So sometimes as well, people will skip panels that don't even have text, or they don't have a main character, in order to get to panels that do have text, particularly if that text is at the top of a panel. Now, this image that I have up here on this slide isn't a great example of that, because all of these panels, even the ones that don't have any dialogue or don't have any text in them, they all have a main character. But I don't know about you guys, and again, this image wasn't used in any of these research studies. It was just one that I pulled out. But if I'm looking at it, so like I'm looking at, starting at the top panel, I'm looking at the look that Wonder Woman is giving Batman. And maybe on like my second or third viewing of this panel, I see Robin's face over there, like, oh my god. But I'm focusing on like the two main characters, especially Wonder Woman, because she's giving Batman a look for some reason. I'm sure it's probably a good reason. And then I'm hopping down there to the panel in the second row, but on the left. But I'm not spending a whole lot of time on that because there's no text. There's no real action that's going on. So then my next thing is that I'm going to look at Wonder Woman, but look quickly like what Darkseid is saying over here. Like, well, that's not a whole lot of text there. Going down to the bottom row with that panel on the left where she's punching Darkseid. Now I'm like, okay, there's action happening. This text is pretty big, and also it's kind of a word that I don't really understand because it's onomatopoeia and it's one I'm not used to. So that's taking me a little bit longer to figure out. And then I go over to the right, but up there where she's like, and she's like, oh my hand. And again, going down, looking at, so one, I'm navigating all of this, right? And I was just trying to follow along with me, but I'm looking at that text. So to get down there to where the action is and where there is some kind of interaction, some dialogue, some text, I'm going through those first three panels pretty quickly and just getting down there to like, where is the most pertinent info for me to pay attention to, so I can extract that. And so by skipping panels, we're kind of like, we are focusing on panels and we are looking at them, but as we're reading, but we're also kind of like with our peripheral vision, looking onto and trying to expect what's the next place that I'm going to go. Okay, so the next step, so we got, visual information is actually coming in to our brain. We're turning that visual information, that reflected light, I guess, into something that our brain can process, and that's a neural impulse. And to extract more information, we're paying attention to it. So we're looking at certain things, and we're looking at it in certain orders, and we're prioritizing some information over others. So if you pay attention to something certainly long enough, and if it's meaningful enough to you, now it's something, not only is our occipital lobe paying attention to it because it's visual information, but now it's moving into our memory, what's called our working memory. And that's something, okay, we're paying attention to it, we're thinking about it right now. That's what working memory is. And so now all the parts of our brain that deal with memory and working memory, they start getting engaged as well. So as you're going from like, panel to panel, and you're getting all of this information and you're following a story, you're holding the different info that you've extracted in your memory. And so you kind of chunk it because it's a lot of info. So say, for example, like, okay, so comics are really, they're a serial medium. And what I mean by that is, like, you have this ongoing story and it comes out maybe once a month or every 2 weeks or something. Or I read a lot of comics on, what's that app called? Webtoon. And so I get updates every week. So when I open up, I get a notification for an update for my favorite Webtoon comic. it's been a week since I last looked at it, but it's there in my memory. And so what I mean by chunking it is that I don't necessarily remember every single detail or every single panel separately, but I've created kind of like this gist of what happens. And so it makes it easier for me to remember like this overall gist, kind of combining the story into one cool little package than a bunch of little packages. But as I'm currently reading something, I remember what happens on page 1, even though I'm on page 7, and that's because our minds hold that in that memory. As long as we're paying attention to it, it's what's in our working memory. Now, a working memory, sometimes it's also referred to as our short-term memory, and that's because if we stop paying attention to something, it leaves our working memory real fast. I mean, like 30 seconds kind of fast. So on one hand, so as we're trying to like hold all of this stuff in our mind, and which sometimes people, researchers will refer to as like a mental model. It's kind of like, all right, here's my mental idea of what's going on in this story, the characters, the setting, everybody's goals, stuff like that. That's a lot of info, and like we can kind of chunk it into these cool packages, but we can't pay attention to everything at once, and we only have so much like mental resources to hold all of that information. What's kind of cool about comics is some of that visual information we don't have to hold in our minds constantly. It's right there on the page, and so we get reminded about it later. Like I don't constantly have to be like, okay, here's the setting that they're in. Like sometimes I have to do with text. I don't constantly have to remind myself of the setting because I see the setting, and so that visual information is not something I have to mentally hold, but something that the page kind of holds for me. Which is cool. And so we focus on something, we give it attention, and that moves it. It kind of like prioritizes it to like, okay, I'm paying attention to it right now. It's in my working memory. It's not just this info that's not important. It's obviously important. I'm paying attention to it. I'm working with it, this working memory. And if that's something that kind of like matters to us, maybe it moves into that mental model, like, oh, here's this new information of like what's going on in the story. That's important. Or, oh, here's this thing that I saw back there. It moves into what's called our long-term memory. And again, like working memory only lasts for about 30 seconds. So when I'm talking about like a long-term memory, or when psychologists talk about a long-term memory, they're talking about anything that lasts longer from a few minutes on. So long-term memory doesn't even have to be super long. But when we're reading comics, like if I'm reading my updated episode from my webtoon comics, and I can remember what happened previously last week, and I'm like, okay, I know where we're picking up. Here's where this new episode is. Okay, I remember what happened last week. Cool. It moved at some point from my working memory into my long-term memory. Okay, so that's memory and just like working with stuff. So if you're paying attention to something, it's in your working memory. So now, okay, we're working with it. We've paid attention to it. We're looking at it, and now we're like actively trying to process it and figure out what's going on. So that gets into this idea of comprehension. And with comics, there's so much different kind of information. So we have text information, reading the text, which does take us a little bit longer. So we have to kind of like prioritize that info. And then we also have the visual information. So we have a whole lot of different kind of info. So like we see one, like what is the scene? Where are they at? Who are the characters who are there? And then we have like this kind of this event information. What are the characters doing? Why are they doing it? Do they have goals? Are there consequences of those goals? Are they having emotional reactions to it? And then we have this idea of just look what makes a story, and that helps us kind of understand like, okay, if there's this action, maybe there's like a bad guy or a good guy. What does that look like? We kind of expect that the good guy will come out on top. We know that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we kind of expect like this, like from literature class, like a rising action and then like some kind of conclusion or wrap up at the end. So not only are we looking at visual and textual stuff, but we're also just looking at things like what kind of information is most pertinent for me to understand for this story. So we have all of this visual information is really our visual sense is picking up info through our eyes, turning it into something that we can comprehend, our brain can work with, and those neural impulses, and we pay attention to the important information, including attention to the important information. We are staying away from the stuff that's not important, and sometimes that gets a little bit hard. We might get distracted by the little details, but usually we pay attention to the stuff that makes the most. That is the most pertinent to us understanding the story. And then all that gets moved into our working memory. So we pay attention oftentimes to the first image that we see in a comic book issue or on the first page of a graphic novel, to whatever sets the scene. And oftentimes, like if you get a comic book issue, that first page will be what people refer to as a splash page. So it won't be like a bunch of different panels. It'll be a whole image, just one image on a page, or like a whole panel on a page, I guess I should say. And it's setting the scene. And we pay a lot of attention to that because when we're trying to make this, this thing called a mental model and figure out like, okay, well, what's going on in this story? Who's there? Where are we at? When are we? What are we doing? What, like all of these different things. To get all of that first info, we spend a lot of time looking and processing, giving attention to that first image. And then we're like, okay, I understand what the setting is. I understand where we're at, what we're doing. Let's move on. Let's get that new info. So now, there's some new processes that we haven't talked about yet that lead to us being able to comprehend comics and stories and narrative. And one of those things is called inferences. So like I'm piecing together, you're giving me all of this different info from a comic book page, and we'll get to this a little bit more in a few slides, where stories don't tell you every little single thing that happens from point to point. You fill in the gaps. Even in just like a regular book with just text, sometimes there's a sentence and then another sentence, and there's a gap in between the two of them, and it's so small sometimes that we kind of take it for granted, but we fill that in like, okay, I know based on this whole settings, like, okay, I see them sitting in a booth. There's two people sitting in a booth. There's a basket of tortilla chips that are between them on this table. So they don't have to tell me they are sitting in a Mexican restaurant. I know that because I know that a basket of tortilla chips is something that only shows up actually in Mexican restaurants. You don't even have to tell me that they're in a restaurant because I kind of get it from this idea of those booths. So I know from my long-term memory and things that I just kind of know about the world and how things go, this background knowledge, I can infer without people, the authors or the artists, even having to tell me so. So that's me accessing what's called schemas or scripts, and what those are is just like, what do we expect? We have these roles that we have in society. We know what it looks like if I go into a restaurant. The hostess or the host will be like, how many is in my party? And then I'll be like, this many. And then they'll show me to a table where maybe I'll have to wait. But they'll put the menu down and then they'll ask about drink. So I have these scripts of what is supposed to happen. And all of that is in my background knowledge when stored in my long-term memory. So I access that when I'm looking at a story to be able to infer, oh, here's what's going on. And all of that stuff, the background knowledge also helps me to predict what's going to happen later in the story. It's like, oh, okay, all of this stuff is going down. I bet this is what's going to happen next. And we might not even think that, but we do anyways. We kind of make these predictions. And then later, we might get new information that contradicts those predictions. We update it. We get new info and we update our understanding of what's going on in the story. So people's background knowledge differs from person to person. So for example, I was talking about maybe you're not used to reading comics. Maybe that's not really your thing, or you're just recently got into it. Or I gave the example of I enjoy reading manga now, but it took me a while. I didn't have prior experience, so it took me a little while to get used to the layout and to become kind of quick at how well I read it. So different people's background knowledge just differs just based on things that we know. And so that might influence how we comprehend a story. And also how experienced you are with comics is going to affect whether or not you are skipping those panels to get onto the more pertinent information. It might influence how well you're able to look at something and be like, okay, that's the pertinent information that I need to go to. People who are more experienced with comics, they skip a lot more. They skip those panels and they head straight to the stuff that they need to get. Okay, so I talked about this for a little bit ago, but so comics are made up of what's called panels, those little windows on the page that we look at when we flip to the next one. So each one of these boxes with different images in it is a panel, and that space in between all of those images is referred to as a gutter. So a few things going on here. One, when we're looking at a comic book page and we're going from panel to panel to panel, in the same way that I talked about a sentence, might give us some information and then a next sentence, and in between those two sentences there might be a gap, and we kind of fill in that gap with these inferences. That's the same thing that happens. You can kind of think of panels as a sentence. We fill in the gap. We know what happens in that gutter. So looking back at this image again, so we have that first image of the two people holding two guns, and then the next one is this person has his foot up there, and now there's a bunch of wood. But we can infer in between those two panels what happens in that gap, what happens in that gutter is that front guy there must have kicked in a door or something. So now that they're entering some place that was blocked to them, and he kicked it in, and that's why all the wood is shattering. So that's all of the actions that happen just in that tiny little white space. And so with these inferences, that's us filling in the gap, figuring out what is the action that is necessary, that must have happened in the gutter that gets us from point A to point B, and so on. Now, sometimes panels go from they switch scenes on us. And I'll skip on down here to this one image, just to make an example of this. But if you look at this first image here, and this is Bruce Wayne, Batman's origin story. Here he is. He's at a scene where his family died, and he's crying, and you're like, okay, he's at the same place. He is physically in the same scene in these first two. But now here's him at, and here's where he's at in his bedroom, praying at his bed. And now here's a dude, we figure out, that that's Bruce Wayne, and here he is in a lab. Here he is holding up a dumbbell, a barbell, something. Now he's in his den. I don't know what rich people have, But and these other two here is like, okay, this is all in the same place. I know that this place is different than this science-y thing is a different event, a different scene than down here where he's in like a nice, I don't know, robe or something. And it's certainly different than this last one where he's Batman up here at the top. So what I'm getting at is we fill in the gaps to get us from one panel to another when they are close enough for us to recognize, hey, this is all the same scene, this is all the same event. And now here's this new panel, and I know that this information is different enough that I'm not trying to connect it to these previous ones. I'm starting something new. This is a new scene, a new event, and now I'm starting a new one. And now, like, oh, okay, there's enough overlap in these panels that I know that they're all part of the same scene. So I kind of clump those together. And this whole idea is referred to as something called event segmentation. So basically, it's just breaking up different events and different scenes that happen in a story into separate ones, instead of trying to be like, oh wow, it's all just one long continuous thing. We break it up into these different scenes, into these different events. So this is kind of make more of that. We interpret, we make assumptions about what happens, and usually, for the most part, they're right, unless we get information that tells us, no, that wasn't right, and then I update, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is what must have happened. And so that kind of brings us to this idea of predictions, like what's going to happen next. We make predictions, and then when we finally get to the information, it tells us whether or not our prediction was right or if it was wrong. And if it was wrong, the next thing that we have to do is update, like, oh, okay, so here's what actually happened. I wasn't expecting that, but cool. Here's what is actually going on. And then we probably make more inferences and more predictions based on that. And that whole process, it's kind of weird, it's kind of clunky, it's kind of long to like actually talk out, even though it happens really fast, is something that makes comic strips like Peanuts really funny. So like if you just look at those first two panels, you see Charlie Brown winding up, and then he pitches. Your prediction is probably like, okay, either he's going to strike out the guy, or the player, the batter, or the batter is going to hit the ball. Okay, we don't usually expect that the ball is going to come flying back at Charlie Brown and knock all of his clothes off. So this comic strips are funny because it counts on us to make predictions about what we think are going to happen, and the author does something completely different. And so it's that incongruency between like, oh, I thought this, but here's this whole new thing that makes it funny. Now obviously like explaining a joke isn't always super funny, but like, you know what I'm saying. Anyways, so all of this is going on, and I talked to you guys about these eye movement studies, but we also have studies where it's measuring what kind of neural responses we're actually having. So how is our brain lighting up as we're reading this info? So we go along and we're making predictions and we're making inferences. So we have a certain kind of neural response when we get really cool, meaningful information, and then something else happens. This other kind of neural response happens when we must have made predictions, and then here's this new information that it gets violated. So we can actually see the brain getting engaged and lighting up in these studies when people are reading these graphic narratives. This one researcher named Neil Kahn has done a lot of work with that. Some really cool stuff. And he's also found that at the same time that we're reading these visual stories, these graphic narratives, even if there isn't any text that's going on in these stories, the same parts of our brain, and they're called Broca's and Wernicke's, that deal with language comprehension, understanding language, you're taking in language and hearing it, and also expressing language, they also light up. Even though there's not any text going on, technically, I guess not any language, going on, the language areas of our brain still light up, kind of making the case for, I guess, kind of like a what MomoCon refers to as like a visual language, which is pretty cool. So, getting through all of that, we have these two kinds of information. That visual information that we're looking at, we're paying attention to. When we pay attention to it, it comes into our working memory and we're processing it. And we're processing it using our background knowledge. We're using things that are in our long-term memory. We're making inferences, we're making predictions, and we're updating everything that we're kind of holding in our mind at that time. And then eventually, if we find it pretty important, and that's kind of the key, if we kind of find this interesting and important in some way, we put it into our long-term memory for later. So we got all of that going on. But sometimes the visual and the text information, they're not always on board. So, for example, they could overlap. So, like, if in this one image here with Rorschach, this first one of him, if there was text information that said he was looking at the smiley face button, that would overlap, right? Like, because you get the visual information and the text information, and it would be saying the same thing. You're like, okay, yeah, I get that, thank you. But sometimes it, especially like older comics, they often included dialogue that described exactly what they were doing, and it was like, okay, thank you for this play-by-play, but I can see it. Sometimes the visual information is just kind of there, and then the text information is giving you something brand new. So not only are you taking in what's going on with the images, you're figuring all of that out, but you're also processing all of that, but now you're also processing the text stuff. Sometimes they contradict. It doesn't make any sense. So, like, say, like, you have an image of somebody making, like, they're visually very upset, like they're mad, they're pissed off, whatever. But they have dialogue that says everything is fine. So the text and the visual cues contradict. So what do you figure out? You have to be able to integrate those somehow and figure out, well, what's really going on here? And all of this is happening, pretty quickly. And in all of the, going back to the inferences and the updating, and there's some discussion with the research about whether or not we're processing the text and the visual stuff completely separately. But as we talked about, and something that I personally think myself, just reading what other researchers have done, is we're doing it all at the same time, because the visual stuff influences what text I'm going to go to first, and vice versa, and what order, and when I'm going to pay attention to it. So I'm doing everything all at the same time, that whole process that I've just spent 38 minutes kind of describing to you. And it happens not only with this two information, the text and the images, but I'm using them in tandem together, and doing it fairly quickly, relatively quickly. So now I told you guys the other part that I was going to talk about is just kind of like the art of comics. I find it incredibly amazing as psychologists and cognitive psychologists, and maybe like the humanities, as different types of researchers are researching comics. I think we're kind of confirming things that artists knew all along. I don't want to speak too much out of turn, because, like, sometimes I'll read a comic book and I'm like, oh wow, the way that they laid this out was kind of confusing. I wish they had done it this way. So not all artists, but like for the most part, artists who know what they're doing, and have been doing this for a minute, or who have studied, or maybe just have, like, I don't know, an innate talent for it, they know how to focus the reader's, the viewer's attention, and they do so with different techniques. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of it, because I don't really feel like I'm that much of an expert, but some of the stuff that we have, that I would like to share with you that we have looked at, is one, just how, at least American comics, and American comics are the things that that I have read about and I've looked at, just how it's changed. So we have this page here that is from, I want to say, 1940, and it's the first time that Bruce Wayne or Batman's origin story is explained. And just look at the art and compare it to a fairly recent Batman comic book page. One, we have fewer panels. So here's 9 panels as compared to 5 now. And look at how much text has been how much we've reduced text on a page. So like in some of these, for the older one, it's taking up almost a half or like a third of the panel isn't even, an image. It's just text. Where here it's just these little blurbs taking up just a fraction of what the panel is going on. And you'll also notice just like the palette is a little darker, and that's something that kind of has been changing, not only just like comics in general, but like specifically it's been changing with film. Films have become darker, just like visually, their color palette. And specifically, not all comics, but graphic fantasy comics have become darker as well. And so here, the thing about comics that I really like, and we kind of talked about this before, is how much you can reduce an image and someone still gets it. So like in this image with, Batman just kind of being moody on a gargoyle, we have all this background information, but I know this is the city of Gotham. These are just like an outline of these buildings, but I understand what they are. There's not a whole lot of detail going on in this image, but I get it. And so we can reduce an image down to just its bare components. And again, like those Hellboy comics are really top notch at doing this, reducing it down, and we still understand what it is. So it's not that it is a realistic image like a photograph. We're not trying to make a photograph on a page, or artists aren't, but they are trying to get readers to understand what's going on and to know what it is that they're drawing, and not necessarily use a whole lot of detail. And again, more detail, the longer it takes for me to process, the longer I look at it. But here we kind of almost reduce things down to their bare minimum, and they become almost metaphorical. And one thing that I really like, it's a quote that I've taken from one of these researchers that I've looked at, is we make sense of our lives through storytelling. And it doesn't even have to be, again, like I said, like this, a realistic image and like a almost documentary style type telling. We can use these metaphors and these reduced images to still make sense of what's going on in real life, but in more of like a figural sense in comics and with these images. And one of the ways that we do that, or to help us understand what's going on with these static images that we see in comic books, is the use of symbols. So like over here I have this image of Black Canary, and she has her mouth open. Now I can't hear Black Canary, and I don't see any motion in a comic panel, but because of these circles that are surrounding her, I take those circles as symbols that mean she is screaming. And because I know what goes on with Black Canary, I know that she has like this supersonic scream, and there are these vibrations that are going through the air, and those vibrations are what the circles represent. Or this image here from Scott McCloud's, what was the name of it? Understanding Comics. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he kind of explains the use of symbols and different ways artists show like the passage of time or change of scene, or different things like that, and I highly recommend it. But these images show motion lines, and the different ways that we can draw motion lines can show like how fast someone is going, the passage of time even. But we use those kind of symbols to make up for the fact that comics don't show motion and they don't show sound. Now, with that though, different cultures use different symbols. So again, this kind of goes back to the whole idea of like your background knowledge. If you don't belong to a culture and if you're not particularly familiar with it, you might not understand what these different symbols mean. So like I have Edward Elric here, and he has kind of like these little squiggles on his forehead. I know that that means kind of like a vein popping out, and he's mad, and his eyes have changed. They've gotten like completely devoid of any kind of information. They're just completely white, and there's this background has become darker. I know that that means he's mad. But over here in an American comic with an entirely different artist and a different character, someone is expressing anger a lot differently than how it's expressed in this manga. So different things can be used to symbolize different stuff that's going on in a story, but a lot of it depends again on culture. So that gets me to manga, and I've brought it up a few times. They also just manga artists and storytellers use different techniques than American artists and storytellers. They're more they use more what's referred to as like movie-like techniques. So they're more they might use more artsy shots, like maybe from the floor up. Different angles that maybe we don't use as much in American or Western comics. They get a little bit more flexible with it, like how they are going to arrange and how they arrange panels, how they show emotion in the character's eyes. Again, coming back here to Edward, this is kind of a bad comparison because Batman's eyes are like this, but that's because of his mask. But usually we don't show a character's, an American artist doesn't show a character's eyes like that unless they are getting like heavy influences from manga. And so all of these different things that we use, or different cultures, different artists, different writers will use to express different emotions or different actions that are happening in a visual story. So the big takeaway that I guess I was trying to express to you guys, if I wanted you guys to take anything away, it's this kind of short little blurb that I have here on this last slide. I guess I really reduced it down to not a whole lot, but like your brain on comics and what it takes to comprehend these visual stories, these graphic narratives. The big word here is this interaction, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on all at the same time, and it all happens really, really fast. And some of it is biological evolution. It's just how our eyes work and what we're focusing on and what kind of things grab our attention, and just that's just biology. And then we have you're taking in this sensory information, this visually sensory information, and how do we interpret that? And a lot of how we interpret it and how we process it is going to be based on our personal experiences, our personal background information, the languages that we speak, different experiences that we have, and how well we're able to make those inferences and those predictions and update our mental understanding of everything's going on. And some of that is just personal and an individual, and some of it is just it's cultural. It's something that we've learned and something that we've kind of established as different societies or as different cultures. And so this biology and this individual part and this cultural part, they're all playing together all at the same time. And it's kind of crazy and it's kind of awesome. And I hope you guys have enjoyed what I've been able to just like express to you guys about comics and everything that's going on with them. It's a topic that I personally am pretty, hopefully you can tell, pretty passionate about. As I've been like showing you all of these different slides and all of this different information and talking about it, I've had, and like you can see it on this slide here, these names with a date inside a little parentheses, and those are the researchers who have done all of this work, so that I can talk about this kind of stuff with you, and so we can understand what's going on. And if you've got any of you guys want any kind of like references to know more about that, you can contact me, and I will gladly share with you guys any kind of information that I have. You can contact me on Twitter. I have a Facebook page, and Instagram is probably like the easiest way. I also have a website that is superpsych.com, and you can also find my book on the Netflix Defenders TV series on Amazon. And so that goes like, I go every episode through the first season of Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, and yeah, Iron Fist as well. Again, thank you guys for tuning into this and letting me talk at you, and I hope you've gotten something really cool out of all of this. And please, if you enjoyed it, let the organizers at MomoCon know how much you've appreciated this, because they're working hard at still being able to bring you guys cool content, even if we can't meet all together at a convention center. So thank you guys, and I hope you stay safe.